Welcome everyone again. My name is Brandon Cook. I'm an apprentice trainer with reInvent. Very fun to be with you tonight. It's been very fun doing these Thursday night calls, and it's really special to see grads all across the country. So welcome. Thank you for joining us. And let's, in the interest of time, let's jump right into our topic tonight. First, I want to start with a question. Actually, one of our grads sent the leadership team a consideration, a question that I'll paraphrase. What do we do when life strips away what we're familiar with and we're left facing ourselves? And I thought that was a great question. You know, maybe you can imagine a scenario where you lose a job, or maybe you become empty nesters, your children leave, and it feels like what you've known is stripped away. And then in the wake of that, you have to face yourself and be with yourself in a new way. I think that's a great consideration for quarantine, because we're all forced into that right now, and we are life is stripped away in a very unique sense. But it's also a practice and a discipline to ask at all times. It's like the consideration is, how do I live into who God has created me to be in the core of my being, such that when I do face myself, what I find there is congruent, like it's congruent with the person that I want to be. And we become congruent through training ourselves to make good choices, the choices that lead to life, the choices that lead us towards our vision and the person we want to be. So the question we're going to engage in this call, Inyo and I, are how do we center ourselves in our true God-given self so that we make choices that lead us into who we want to be. So first of all, we're going to watch a simple video, a 3-minute video that explores this idea, and then we'll flesh it out. And in the course of this call, or this workshop, we're going to land on 3 practices that you can engage to live from your God-given core self, your true self in God, and from that place, make life-giving choices. So Chris, if you'll play that video, we're ready.
All day long, humans do things. Even if it's just sleeping. Now, some things we do move us towards the sort of life we want. When we're behaving like the sort of person we want to be, doing things that make life richer, fuller, more meaningful, we can call these towards moves. Now, other things we do move us away from the life we want to live. When we're acting ineffectively, behaving unlike the sort of person we want to be, doing things that tend to make life worse in the long term, we can call these away moves. Now, when things are going well, when life is giving us what we want, it's pretty easy for us to choose towards moves, to act effectively, doing stuff that makes life richer and more meaningful. But unfortunately, life just isn't that easy most of the time, and it doesn't give us what we want for very long. So as we go about our day, all sorts of difficult situations and difficult thoughts and feelings will arise. We may experience emotions such as worry, we may catastrophize, predict the worst, we may have thoughts popping up that I'm not good enough, I'm a loser, I'm a failure, life sucks, it's all too hard. Now, unfortunately, we easily get hooked by those difficult thoughts and feelings. And almost every psychological problem, from stress and anxiety to depression and addiction, boils down to this basic process. We get hooked by difficult thoughts and feelings, and we do away moves. However, there are times when most of us are able to unhook from these difficult thoughts and feelings and choose towards moves instead. And the better we get at doing this, the better life gets. So that's what this approach is all about. We're going to bring in some helpers to help you get a lot better at choosing towards moves. As a first step, we're going to help you identify your values, who you care about, what matters to you, what sort of person you want to be, and use those values to guide and inspire and motivate you to do more towards moves. And we're also going to develop unhooking skills so you can get a lot better and a lot faster at unhooking yourself from all those difficult thoughts, feelings, emotions, and memories. The more we develop our ability to unhook and choose those towards moves that really matter deep in our heart, the greater our quality of life, the greater our health, happiness, and well-being.
Awesome. Thank you, Chris. I'm always surprised and very grateful when technology works the way that it's supposed to. That was great. And
that's because of my incredible technical skill.
Exactly. So we're going to jump into this idea of this video, and especially the unhooking practices that they mentioned in the video. So the idea of the video is simple, right? We're always making choices that are taking us towards or away. And when we're hooked, to use their language, when we're pinballing is the language that I'll use on this call, it's hard to make those decisions that take us towards. So again, the question for us tonight is, how do you make choices that take you towards the person that you want to, in your heart of hearts, you want to be, that you want to become, the kind of person who creates the kind of experiences that you want to create for yourself and for others? That's the key question. How do we find and live from our true self that takes us towards who we want to be? And I do want to say, I use the word true self cautiously because that's a phrase that gets bandied about a lot right now. There's a lot of talk about rediscovering your true self as if it's lost somewhere. And that's not how I mean it. What we're talking about is, like Scripture talks about in the book of Deuteronomy, it tells us to choose life. There's a part of us that can choose life. And in any situation, we can make a choice that leads to life for ourselves and for others. Do we always make it? Probably not. But we can train ourselves to make it, to step into it more and more and more. And then the Scripture also makes a distinction between spirit and flesh, or what we might update language to ego, spirit and ego. So the true self, this God-given self within us, it's when we are living from that, it's like living by the Spirit. Think of it as a part of you that wants to be big and expansive and generous in your choices. That's like your true self is like your big God-given self. And think of your flesh or your ego as your small self. It's like the stingy, greedy, unforgiving self. And if we are new creations in God, we can choose to live from the Spirit, in line with the Spirit, in order to choose a life in any situation. And in all situations that we're facing, some part of us actually wants to make this big, expansive, generous, trusting choice. And at the same time, there's some part of us that wants to maintain control. Play a small game because it's a safer game. That's why we choose it, because it's safer, but it doesn't generally lead to flourishing or lead to life. I mean, think about it. For example, how many of you have been in a situation where there was someone you wanted to forgive, and you truly wanted to forgive, and yet it also kind of felt like you might die if you actually forgave them? Anybody experience that? Yeah, it's like part of us wants to forgive. I'll speak for myself. Part of me wants to forgive. My ego wants to maintain control, not have to be vulnerable, not have to give up the reward of being right. But when we make a choice to forgive, we are living from our true God-given self. And at the same time, I find that it's hard. It feels hard to make a big, expansive, generous, true self, God-given self choice when I'm pinballing or when I'm hooked, to use the language of the video. My friend Cody Miller, I heard this metaphor that he used recently of pinballing, and I think it's so helpful that sometimes our mind, our thoughts, and our emotion get triggered, and then it's pinballing. That's just part of what happens in life, like they discussed in the video. Life doesn't always go our way. We can have an interaction with someone. Could be someone in line at Starbucks, could be our spouse, it could be an email that we get that triggers us, and we start to pinball in anxiety or worry or frustration. The question is, how do we come back from this? How do we unhook? How do you center yourself to make a good choice while or after you're pinballing? Because it can feel very difficult to make that big, expansive, generous choice when we are pinballing. Have you ever sent a text? Have you ever sent a text and the other person doesn't respond, and you start thinking, like, what's going on? Why aren't they responding? Hey, they responded on this other thread over here. Hey, this is important. No one cares for me. Don't you know who I am? You know, it can escalate quite quickly, at least it can in myself. So it's like there's these stories that are there that we can start pinballing within, and it's suddenly it's like we lose grounding point with the part of us that makes expansive, generous choices. I was in, very recently, I was in a negotiation with a friend, and I got an email, and it was a reasonable email from a certain perspective, and it was about a decision they made about a business decision we were deciding together, and it really surprised me, and it disappointed me, and I got anxious. I started pinballing. I got up. I started walking around the neighborhood to try to calm my anxiety. I was pinballing. Sometimes your whole body can pinball, right? I was just bouncing around. And I was saying to myself, I know that I'm being a crazy person, but I can't find the off switch for that. I can't seem to stop. And it was hard to access that centered, God-given self. And oftentimes it's because when we're pinballing, it's actually tapping in to some survival story that we tell ourselves, like the email that I got from this person was about money. And so I wasn't just hearing their email. I was hearing, how can I provide for my family? And does this person not appreciate the work that I've done? It was tapping into deeper narratives that I sometimes indulge about myself. And so I engaged in some practices to come back to center so that I could make a good centered choice, I think. But that took a lot of effort. And so tonight we're going to talk about 3 practices that you can engage to come back to center. But first I want to ask you to consider, so that this isn't just some sort of theoretical conversation, think about your own life. And think right now of a crossroads or a decision point or a circumstance that you are in right now. Identify a decision or a situation where you really want and need to access your best self, your true God-given self, in order to make a really good, life-giving, powerful choice. It could be something that you deem big, like a job transition or a difficult forgiveness journey you need to embark on. It could be how to have a good attitude with your kids. It might be something that feels small. It could be like that story I told you, getting an email or a text or something that caused you to pinball. It could be dealing with a teenage child or a 2-year-old. I hear that that's very similar. It may be a situation, just any situation where you're pinballing. It might be one of those. So we're going to break out into groups, one-on-one, briefly. And my invitation is to share a situation or circumstance in your life right now where you're seeking, and maybe you're struggling to make a good, whole, life-giving choice. And it's okay if you don't know what the right choice is. Like if you're struggling to even know that, that's perfect, because the exercise we're going to engage tonight will help you get clear on how you want to respond. If you aren't watching this live, if you're watching this after we've recorded, then just take this time to write out so that it grounds in your mind and your heart, whatever that situation is. So again, think of a crossroad, a decision point you're in right now. Identify a decision or situation where you need to access your best self, your true God-given self, to make a really good choice. You're going to have 2 minutes each to talk. So one person will talk for 2 minutes. You may need to, once Zoom's going to break you out into groups, so you'll be randomly paired with someone. If there's 2 of you on screen, then you'll just need to share the time, divvy up the time. So you might have 3 people in your group. That's fine. Just use the time accordingly. You may need to unmute yourself, which you do by in the bottom left-hand corner of your screen. You click on the unmute button. Once you're in your group, it'll unmute you. And then Zoom will automatically put you back into this large group meeting. So again, you'll have 2 minutes each. Share a situation where you're struggling, where you're seeking to make a choice that will lead you towards your vision, your true self, your God-given centered self. Okay? Chris is going to break us up once again. Thank you, Chris.
All right, let's face it. Let's be honest. Our default, our thrown to-ness is towards the away things, because that's what keeps us comfortable, keeps us like we feel like we're in control of something. It keeps us safe in a manner of speaking by just defaulting into those easier to choose areas. So the question that we're going to keep putting before you as we unfold this is, how can you train yourself into living into your centered, expansive, and if you will, true self? You know, the type of person and the type of experiences you want to actually have if you got rid of all those things that hook you, right? And so as we go through this, I just want to bring up, and actually ties into the first practice ties into the first session that we did in this flourishing series. And that has to do with surrender, or if you will, acceptance. And so what am I talking about surrendering to and accepting? Well, the number one thing, there's many things, but one of the things that comes to mind is just that tendency to just be aware that is the human tendency, is to be pulled into, hooked into those things that you've grown into, and you've developed strategies to manage and to make yourself survive in it. But it's very easy to get hooked in it. And for me, one of the conversations I constantly get that can hold me back is, I don't know if I'm adequate or good enough to do this and stuff like that. So even though I've developed certain proficiencies in a lot of the things that I do, whenever I'm in, have an option to do something that would really expand me, I wrestle with myself. I do that pinballing thing that Brandon was talking about. And, and I go back and forth. And I'll tell you, I've been doing this for a long time with people. And I think you can all identify that there's times when you're going for something new, there's a part of you that certainly wants it, and there's a part of you that is certainly resisting it. And so the opposite of resisting is surrendering or accepting that that's going to be there, and it's probably not going to go away. And so, we all have these pulls. In that video, it showed like little hooks, but if you think of them pulling you towards, your space that feels comfortable, where you feel safe, where you don't have to really risk a lot, right? Those are little pulls. And Chris last week, shared a very good one that he developed early on in life, which is about, really achieving and being proficient at things, because that's how he decided to make life work. I had a quite different strategy. I went to, how do I stay comfortable and maintain control and avoid, right? And Brandon, I think he wouldn't mind me sharing, his is like, well, how do I understand everything? And, and that kind of stuff. And so we all have our tendencies. And the first step in this process is to accept that they're there. Now, I don't know how many of you saw the movie A Beautiful Mind. Raise your hand if you did. Beautiful Mind. It's a great movie to watch. I highly recommend it. It's a true story about this professor named Nash, who is a mathematical genius. And he had something that kept occurring for him. I'm not going to give it away, so for those of you that haven't seen it. But he had something that kept occurring for him that actually thwarted his whole life. And he actually was not really engaged in his real life. He was engaged in this, what's the opposite of real life? Not a fake life, but it just wasn't
Fantasy.
It wasn't reality. All right. And so, and I love how the movie ends up, because his quote unquote healing came when he became so aware of his tendencies that he was no longer controlled by them. Those of you that have been to reinvent training know that we say that it's impossible to shift what you're unaware of. What you're unaware of is running your number. And if you're not aware of it, you just think you're making the most logical choices. But really, it could just be a choice, most likely, about maintaining control and comfort and stuff like that. So some of these hooks are based on recurring thoughts that you've had ever since you were little. Some are based on wanting to avoid uncomfortable things. Some are based on wanting to remain in control or be right. And so accepting the tendency is the first step. Accepting that you have that tendency, being so aware of your machinery, if you will, that you are just no longer run by it without you being aware of it. It's almost like you can expect it. Some of you have seen me do this in a training. It's like, yeah, here's that conversation right here. It's a part of me, and oh, I knew you were going to be here, right? So it's like, it's welcoming it, it's embracing it in the sense of accepting that it's there. And it does not need to go away in order for you to succeed. That's the key. That's the key to unhooking it. And so we're in the third practice, we'll get even more specific on that. So many of the practices that we've introduced in these Thursday night Zoom meetings all can serve that. We did the breathing exercise one, which really helps, when you're really taken over by things, to just calm yourself and breathe. And, like Brandon shared a few minutes ago where, after that email, he had to go take a walk and stuff. It's just, just to do that. And there's a couple exercises in our trainings that use this next, if you want to call it a technique or a practice, which is a welcoming prayer, which instead of resisting something, you allow it to come at you and you say, okay, I'm going to learn from you. I'm going to learn from you. And, those of you that have been to the impact training know that we specifically do that on Friday night. In reinvent training, we do it in the second afternoon, even though they're different exercises. It has that principle. Noticing the internal conversations, we've talked a lot about that. The internal conversations that we're always having, right? Remember that phrase, I'm always in a conversation with myself, and sometimes it involves other people, right? And that's always going on. And the one I've already mentioned, which is accepting that you have this struggle, but the key is without judging yourself for it, right? And not resisting it. It's just by acknowledging that. And in the third practice we'll do tonight, we'll talk about how even to gain some altitude on that. And then, being willing, it takes, though, being willing to hear and see what you would prefer not to hear and see. That's really key. And, there's a few people that have said this, it's attributed to many people, but it says, the treasure you seek most is hidden in the cave that you most fear to enter. And so, if you think about it, when you're willing to face what you'd rather not face, that's where growth happens, right? So what keeps us stuck, though, is when we actually get attached to those feelings, that we get attached to the insistence that things remain in our control and stuff like that. And so that's really a way of resisting it. And, you've heard this other saying, what you resist persists, meaning it doesn't go away. The more you resist it, the more it has you in control. And so, so you need to defuse. We need to defuse ourselves from those troubling thoughts, those troubling feelings, those troubling hauntings that we have, and not take them on as if that's really us. And again, in the third practice, we're really going to get really specific about that. So, so instead of resisting it, we need to realize, and this is one of the most freeing things I've seen people when they accept this in the trainings, it's like, these are human tendencies, not because something's wrong with you, because it's just what's most natural. It really serves our survival instinct. And you know what? When we came up with these strategies, it actually was a type of survival for us, to just get through whatever we were facing when we were young. So as we learn to defuse ourselves from those troubling thoughts, those feelings, the hooks get released, right? So acceptance and surrender, especially I want to emphasize again, without judging that it shouldn't be there, right? It just means it is. You welcome those parts of you, even those parts of you that you prefer not to be there. Welcome them, not like, oh, great, I'm just going to live these out, but welcoming them by acknowledging that they're there. And so when you do this, you're actually inviting yourself into a space that sees more possibilities. You see more choices. So that's a good practice, and that will segue you well into what Brandon's going to discuss next. So Brandon, take it away.
Thanks, Daniel. I love this work that we all get to do. Even knowing these concepts, it's like never ending. Hearing you talking, it's like there's so much beautiful work to be done. Knowing the concepts, it's about the practice of them. So thanks for inviting us into the practice of acceptance and surrender. And I want to invite you into another practice which is labeling or naming. Labeling or naming. This is a practice you can engage in everyday life, and I'm going to flesh it out for you. There's a Chinese proverb that says, the right naming of things is the beginning of wisdom. The right naming of things is the beginning of wisdom. One of the axioms we say in our trainings are, you can't transform what you're not aware of, right? You got to bring it into the light so that it can be transformed. In Scripture, Adam's first task in the garden was the right naming of things, to name reality, to name the animals. And it's really helpful when you're pinballing, when I'm pinballing, to label it, to name it. Oh, I'm pinballing. I'm going crazy right now. Just name it, label it. Actually starts to create some distance from your experience and from yourself. So it's like, then keep naming it. Oh, this situation has me tapped into a survival story, right? And then you can keep labeling, you know what? This sense of being crazy that I have right now is actually not who I am. I'm just having a reaction. And the more you practice naming and labeling what's actually happening, the more space you have. It creates space between you and what's actually happening. So the principle is, when you label what's actually happening and put words to it, it helps you step towards freedom. In other words, making the choice that you really want to make rather than making a reactive choice. Scripture talks about something very similar, bringing things into the light. Your shame and your secrets, they want to be alone with you. That's how they keep power over you, the way that they have you rather than you having them. Or let me say it like this. The way that you have them rather than them having you is by labeling them, naming them, talking about them, shining light on them. So I'm going to invite you into a very simple labeling practice that, again, you can engage in everyday life. And here's how you can practice this naming, this right labeling, with this phrase: what's actually happening here? What's actually happening here? Sometimes you might use the phrase, what's also happening here? And this will make more sense, I think, as we get into this. So asking yourself what's actually happening here is a practice for detaching, or as the video said, unhooking from your triggered pinballing self. To actually pause when you're triggered, when you're pinballing, to say, okay, what's actually happening here? To stop and actually ask that question, right? Because when you do that, you allow your body, your mind, your emotions you allow yourself to get beneath that into your centered God-given self, and actually hear back what your centered God-given self will say back to you when you ask that question. What's actually happening here? It's like sometimes when I engage this, when I'm triggered, when I'm pinballing, I'll ask myself, okay, what's actually happening here? And I'll know within myself, you know what? Part of what's happening is I'm overreacting, right? It's like the answer is there if I just give myself space for my body and my mind and my true self, my God-given self to actually speak back to me. And then once I do that, I can ask myself other questions like, okay, well, what's the truth here? It's like in relation to that email that I got that caused me to pinball. I was actually able to say, you know what they said makes sense. It's really not that big of a deal. I need to not get all worked up about this before I have a conversation with them in person. Email is a terrible form of communication. It's actually talking myself down from the ledge. But you got to interrupt the pinballing in order to talk yourself down. Now, that doesn't mean that everything gets sorted. Like, emotions might still be running high, but I know for myself, I'm much less likely to make an uncentered reactive choice when I'm having a conversation with myself to tone myself down. One of the ways we say this in the training, well, we allow Viktor Frankl to say it for us. Viktor Frankl, who said, between stimulus and response, there's a space. So between what happens, stimulus, and my response, there's a space. And in that space lies our freedom to choose, and in that choice lies our freedom and our happiness. It's like you can actually you can increase the space between what's happened and your response, but it takes pausing and checking in with yourself. What's actually happening here, so that I don't respond to what, like Anil was talking about, the fantasy that I'm making up is happening. It's a really helpful practice. And this is also a great practice for gratitude, for not missing the moment. You think about Jesus' spirituality, really, you could sum up Jesus' spirituality by saying, learn to be right here in the present moment where God is. Think about the Sermon on the Mount. Don't worry. What is worrying going to do? It's not going to add anything to your life. be present in this moment. Look at the lilies of the field. Jesus is constantly inviting us to learn to live right here, where God is, where we can make a powerful, life-giving choice. And, right now I'm at home in quarantine. There's times where I love my kids all the time. And there are times when I just want them to go to bed. I don't want to be asked another question. And when that's happening, I will sometimes check in with myself and I'll say, okay, what's actually happening here, Brandon, while you're annoyed, while you're about to raise the tone of your voice? And it can catalyze a total perspective change for me. When I ask that question, what's actually happening here? It's like, wow, I'm in a holy moment with these sacred human beings that I somehow get to love and raise. And now I may still want them to go to bed, but I can be with them in a different way. Sometimes I'll ask, what's actually happening here? And it's like, I'll realize, I'll just pause and think, I have everything a man could want. I have food and shelter, and I've got a beautiful family. And it's like, boom, back into gratitude, back into appreciating the moment. Now, if I just stay on automatic, if I don't interrupt my pinballing with a question, I guess like Inyo said, I'll just stay in that place because there's something about, there's a reward for me in pinballing, and I can feel justified or righteous or frustrated and angry. And there's an emotional payoff for that. But guess what? It's not a life-giving choice. It doesn't create, I know it doesn't create life for me. And I'm sure you can ask Becca, it doesn't create life. Becca's my wife. Doesn't create life for those around me. So it's like, man, asking myself what's actually happening here actually allows me to come back to the moment and let me enjoy it and not be frantic or, frenetic or hurried for my children to go to bed, but to appreciate what's right in front of me. In other words, when we ask the question, what's actually happening here, it really helps ground us into the question, how do I want to respond in this moment? Part of what we do at reInvent, I'm sure you've heard us use the phrase, and just used it, everything is a conversation, right? And it is constantly within us. And God has given us power to adjust the conversation. You can actually adjust the conversation that's floating through your mind. And Inyo's going to talk to going to lead us through an exercise for this in a moment. By asking the question, what's actually happening here, that's another way to adjust the conversation. And that makes space for your God-given self, the inner observer that is, I think, your soul, your spirit, to make a good, life-giving choice rather than a reactive choice. So think of a situation right now in your life that has been challenging. Think of a situation that's been challenging. Maybe it's quarantine. And think, what's the dominant story that you've been telling yourself about this situation? Now, whatever you're telling yourself about it may be true. It's not like it's all false. That's why sometimes we use the phrase, well, what's also happening here? It's like, hey, quarantine may stink, but, and what else is happening here? You can actually interrupt the negative, grungy conversation by saying, well, what else is happening here? What other it's like a way of triggering your brain into a further consideration. And so I just want to invite you to reframe any situation that's a struggle by saying, okay, what's also happening here, or what's actually happening here? And in fact, let me ask you right now, is there anyone who has a situation in life where you've been pinballing, you've been sort of stuck, but when you ask the question, what's actually happening here, you can begin to reframe the conversation in a way that's more resourceful, a way that's more powerful. Would anybody be willing to share an example that comes to mind? Just unmute yourself and take 30 seconds or a minute to share an example from your life.
I can go. This is
Thank
Kim
you.
from Massachusetts.
Okay.
I think this is pertinent to me as far as I think the pinball for me is that I lost as a musician, like I lost all my gigs, I lost all the plans that I had for the year, and I'm finding myself really defaulting to like numbing out or like mundane tasks or keeping myself just preoccupied and busy. And when I ask what's happening here, I think it's that I'm scared to be present with the grief of the things that I've lost. And then what's also happening is because there's that fear of being with that grief, there is a paralysis from stepping into the possibilities that are available to me in abundance in the midst of this season as well.
Awesome. Thank you for sharing that. That's like a holy thing that you shared. And yeah, so you're naming and labeling the grief, the fear of stepping into the grief. But there's a holy invitation in what you said Kim, of what's also happening here in the midst of it is that there's an invitation to step into the grief and be met by joy potentially, or just new possibilities for how you can be a human being. So thank you very much for sharing that. One other person who has an example, something that you can reframe by asking what's also or what's actually happening here.
I can go.
Hey.
I'm Brittany. I'm from New Hampshire. This is a little bit post conversation with myself. I really felt like I needed to put my house on the market. And I was really unsure of how to do that in this whole process. And there was I wasn't sure if I would be able to move or if anyone would even buy my house. And I had to really just kind of like step out in faith and know that that was what I really needed to do to create a lot of expansion in space, because I didn't want to, I couldn't be tethered here anymore to a house like that. And I actually put it up and I got offer for same day and everything's perfect. But I just had to do that.
Awesome. Congratulations.
Thank you.
Exciting. Yeah. So you actually practiced, okay. You were aware that there was some reticence, some unknown, some fear, but I'm sure you didn't use this phrase, but you asked yourself, well, what's also happening here? I can step into this and see what the possibilities are. Beautiful. Thanks, Brittany and Kim, for sharing. So I'm going to hand it back to Inyo, but I just want to take this metaphor of pinballing and think about it. And again, I got to credit my friend Cody Miller. I don't know where he got this metaphor, but it's beautiful. The more that we practice all the things that we're talking about tonight, acceptance and surrender, labeling and naming, that pinball, a pinball machine, if any of you youngsters know a pinball, don't know what a pinball is, it's about this big, it's a metal ball. Well, the more we practice these disciplines that we're talking about, within us, that pinball starts to gain mass. It can become a softball. Becomes less reactive, right? The bigger something is, it's harder to move around. It can actually turn into a basketball. It can turn into a bowling ball within us, where we increase our self-leadership, and it becomes more and more natural for us to position ourselves, to unhook, and to position ourselves to make the best choice possible. So Inyo is going to take us into a final exercise or a final practice tonight that can help us unhook and ground ourselves.
All right, thank you, Brandon. And really, this exercise is but an expansion of what we've been talking about. But this time, I'd like to ask you to just allow to surface what you may prefer not to look at or hear, because everybody has answers to these questions I'm going to ask you. So everybody, if you would kindly close your eyes and rhetorically answer these questions as I ask them, okay? So just close your eyes, and again, be open, meaning be welcoming to whatever feelings might be stirred up and thoughts and stuff like that. All right? So as Brandon referred to, what is a recent experience that you had that's had you hooked, to use the language in that video, that pulled you towards the small, wanting to be in control self, that did not lead you into your ideal or future self, the type of person you want to become? Think of an experience that came to mind. Maybe it has something to do with this whole COVID-19 thing. I certainly know that that's happened for me. It's thwarted my ideal about what I wanted to have happening during this time. And Kim shared a beautiful experience of that. And Brittany about your house. But just think about it. Could also include an interaction that you had with someone that you love, or a way that you responded with someone that you love, that was hooked and controlled by, if you will, those thoughts, uncomfortable thoughts and feelings, and just the anxiety and fear of like maybe you couldn't be in control anymore. So what feelings are there that hook you into your automatic responses? Is it the fear of not being appreciated or acknowledged? Is it the fear of maybe being inadequate, which I have oftentimes? What feeling is it that hooks you into wanting to, just shrink life down so that you can at least fantasize that you're in control? And that leads into the next question. What benefits, if you will, or payoffs do you get for responding the way that you do in that smaller self, in that ego self? What are those benefits? We always choose something that we see a benefit towards. We're not always aware of that. And as you know, in the trainings that we do, we make people really, we engage people to really become aware of the payoffs they're getting. So allow that to come forth. What's one thing that comes to mind right now that you've been avoiding? And do you know that can choose you to change in an expansive way if instead of avoiding it, you actually engaged it? What treasure might there be if you were willing to enter that cave that you most fear to enter? Now, with that in mind, think about whatever the situation is that you're thinking about, and what choices can you make right now that would move you towards the person and future that you really want, your expansive self, and allow you to grow and transform. And always when you're choosing something like that that's expansive, it also costs you. There's a cost to that, laying down the benefits or rewards. I think many of you know that I had to have my shoulder replaced with a reverse shoulder surgery, and now I'm in physical therapy. Oh, what a joy, right? And so I get to choose the discomfort, the sometimes agonizing stretches that I need to do if I'm looking to regain at least most of what I lost. That big, expansive expression of myself, and not be ruled by the rest of my life by this thing. So there's always cost to these things. So those are the questions. What are the thoughts and feelings that most hook you? What are the feelings that and thoughts hook you into that small self? What benefits or payoffs do you get? What's one thing that comes to mind that if you stopped avoiding it and you actually stepped into right now, would cause you to expand yourself? You would have to transform. And what choices can you make right now that's in alignment towards that future self that you want to be? And what costs are associated with doing that? So the practice that really helps with this has to do with a different form of acceptance. And that's when you notice the thoughts and feelings. You can open your eyes. Just to acknowledge them, to make space for them. We mistakenly think that if we do that, that we'll be taken over by them. But I'm here to assert that it's actually you resisting them that gives them the power. So thoughts were just like a car passing by your front window, like my front window behind me. If I just let the thoughts go by without attaching to them and beating myself up for having them. And, an old early church father, I think it was Martin Luther, not Martin Luther King Jr., but the one that started the Protestant movement. He goes, I have temptations fly through my mind all the time. I just don't build a nest for them. And that's really an apt analogy, I think. That's when we get attached to these kind of feelings that we don't want to have, and we actually judge ourselves for them. It gives them more power, as opposed to just, these are human thoughts. How many of you, your eyes are open, and we can all raise our hand to this, I believe. How many of you had thoughts that shocked you? They just float through your mind. It's like, oh my gosh, where'd that come from? Right? It's like, that's not me, right? And that is the key. It's not you. It's a human thought. It's triggered by all kinds of things. We don't know all the complexities of what does that. And same with feelings. Now, the feelings that you prefer not to have, you actually can expand a space within yourself to actually be with them so that you have your feelings and they no longer have you. But it requires you to actually make room for them as opposed to like, oh, I got to get rid of that feeling, right? And that just somehow gives it more power. All right, so that's a lot of questions. We're running out of time. So what I'd like is for anybody who's willing to share something that they noticed in those rhetorical questions I asked. You don't have to share about each one of them, but something that stood out to you. Who would like to share?
Hi,
Remember-
it's Bonnie from Boston.
Hi,
Hey,
Bonnie.
Hi. The one thing that stood out to me was one of what it seems to be my go-to, that I want to be right. And that's the hook that keeps pulling me back in.
Mm-hmm.
It's something that I've struggled with and continue to struggle with, but by asking these questions, it forced me to name it. So that's
Yeah, and
my
like
reflection there.
Brandon mentioned, you know, when you shine a light on something like that, then you actually make a different choice. You know, because you're going to revert to that often. Yeah, it's been practiced a long time. And when you do say, oh, there I am wanting to be right again, right? You name it and make space for something new. Well, you know, in that same moment, Bonnie, you can ask, so what could I choose if I was willing to let go of being right? What would be a choice that would be congruent with the person I'd want to be? Just a suggestion. Thank you very much, Bonnie. Someone else.
I'll go. I realized that I've been working on an opportunity to do some different thing with my work and my business, and I realized in naming it and labeling it that it's just fear of failure, that if I try to do it, I may fail. And so that's kind of made me go, oh, okay, you know what, then let's go through that process.
That's great. Thank you, Tracy. As you may have heard in the trainings, you know, we try to actually co-opt that word and say, you know what, there is no failure, there's only feedback. You know, it just serves you to know, well, that didn't work. Not that I'm a failure, right? That's
opportunity to learn.
Exactly. So that really transforms the experience. It still may hurt and it still may be disappointing, but it goes from you being a failure to like, oh, that didn't work. What else can I do?
Yeah.
So thank you for that. I think we have time for one or two more.
I'll go. I'm Angie from North Carolina.
Hi,
And-
Angie.
Hi. And what came up for me was thinking about staying small in my coaching business. And it really occurred to me that it's out of a fear of being inadequate. So that was not necessarily something new, but it was, I guess, like, it just reminded me to pay attention to that. To just be more aware, or just continue my awareness of that it's operating. Yeah.
Very good. Thank you, Angie. All right, we have time for one more. Move towards that self you want to be by risking right now.
I have a question.
Okay, Kim, go.
I was wondering, you were saying like accept and surrender and then don't judge. And I'm becoming very keenly aware the last week, as well as in this exercise, it is a default to judge. And then as I start judging, I judge myself when I notice I'm judging myself. So I'm like condemning myself for doing the thing that I'm not supposed to do, or whatever the conversation ends up being. Is there like a trick to help with that? Is there like another formula to go through to like reframe?
That's a complex question and answer to that, but it does involve what we've covered tonight. And that is that noticing that that's your default. And to not only notice it, but expect that it's going to be there again. So that when it shows up, you don't judge yourself for showing up and say, oh yeah, I wonder where, what's actually happening here. I'm judging myself. I'm judging how I want people to think of me, my image, whatever it is, right? When you get clear on what it is that you're judging yourself for, and make peace, which is another form of acceptance. Make peace that you're human, and you're going to do that. Then you don't have to give it the power that it currently has.
So
How
almost
many-
viewing the judgment as a hook.
Yes, absolutely. And it serves you somehow, believe it or not.
Right.
And I would just add to what Inyo said that the more you can laugh at, since we brought Martin Luther into this, Martin Luther was purported to say, a person has as much faith as they have laughter, which I think is amazing. And I would say, Kim, the more that you can laugh at yourself in a lighthearted way, like, oh, I'm doing that thing again that I do where I judge myself for judging myself. Okay, it goes back to what Inyo said about John Nash. The way that he got out of his pathology, his neurosis, was just by saying, oh, there it is again. So the more you can just say, oh, I'm doing that thing. That's so funny. I'm such a human being. And it's like not taking yourself so seriously and like not making it this big thing. Just laugh at it and say, oh yeah, that's funny. I'm doing that human thing again.
Don't forget that nerd that you are.
There you go.
Oh, there's so much nerd.
All right, so we got to wrap it up now. But listen, I want to invite you in a very excited way about what we're going to be up to next week. Next Thursday night, same time, wherever time zone that you're at, same time zone. It's a 1-hour special event that Reinvent Ministries is doing that we call Reinventing the Next Generation. And it's a time for you to hear about the impact that we're making as a ministry. You'll hear from different people. You'll hear from our new apprentices, and that's definitely setting up for the next generation. It's going to have a fundraising element in it, but I want to emphasize, come whether you can give anything or not. It's going to be fun. There's going to be games. There's going to be auction items. We've got some great auction items, some in Texas. We've got a really nice one in California that you can bid on. We have all kinds of raffles and prizes and generous gifts that the grad base is having that you guys can take advantage of, and it'll be shipped to you if you don't live close to where that grad is generating whatever the prize is. It's going to be fun. It's going to be energetic. It's 1 hour long. 1 hour long. We're very excited about it as a ministry, and the leadership team has worked very hard to put this together, and I think you'll enjoy it. I know you'll enjoy it. So come, whether you're in a financial position to give or not. We love you. We want you to experience what we're up to, and that's what's going to happen. Brandon, you want to say anything about that?
No, just an honor to be with everyone. Thanks for being here tonight.
Chris, you want to say anything about that?
Just really appreciate you guys taking time out of your life to be a part of these calls. It's a joy to get to be in them with you and to connect. And look forward to seeing you next week. It's going to be a lot of fun. We have a real live auctioneer who's done like a bazillion auctions, who's going to be doing a lot of the, MC kind of stuff that we're going to be doing. So it'll be a unique experience. So we look forward to being with you again next week. And thank you so much for your faithfulness to connect with us on these Thursday night calls.
So look for an email and invitation for that, and go for it. Join us. All right.
All right. Thank you, everybody.
Good night. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank
Bye-bye.
you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Auf Wiedersehen.